I'm gonna spend the day in the garden today working in serendipity, getting a few things done. And I made myself a list of 7 things that I wanted to work on. I don't know if I'll get to all 7 of them, most likely not, but I'll get to as many as I can and then I'll work on the rest throughout the week. On my to-do list today, I have to plant a citrus tree. I purchased like 5 about a week and a half ago, and I already planted 4 of them with my gremlins, but I'm gonna plant the last one with you. I need to set up some drip irrigation in some new containers that I recently put out into the heart of serendipity, so into the main garden. Most of them are filled with soil, but there's no irrigation and it's heating up, so I can't plant seeds until I have my irrigation set up because otherwise the seeds aren't going to germinate if I can't keep the soil moist. I want to tie back some roses. That shouldn't take too long because I pruned most of them. I really messed up the very first time I pruned my Don Juan roses. I pruned off some of the lateral canes that I shouldn't have taken off, but it's okay. They're gonna do just great. I might sacrifice a few blooms, but next year I know what not to do. But they've already started pushing out so much growth that I definitely need to tie them back. And then I also need to sweep Fig Alley. I think that's one of the messiest places in all of serendipity, and it usually stays messy a bit longer than the rest of the garden just because it's all the way like on the side of the house where I don't really go to unless I'm taking out trash. I feel like I neglect that area a lot more than I should. So I want to go through and just tidy it up, make it really nice and pretty. It also just got really messy because whenever it rains, I think birds start to nest on our roof or something because I'll find like cracked eggs and a bunch of stuff that just comes down from the roof. So it's a little bit yucky. I think that's why I avoid it as well. And then the last thing I want to do is just tie back tomatoes. I have a bunch of tomatoes trellised throughout serendipity, and they're growing so well, but they're gonna get really heavy soon because they're starting to put on a ton of flowers. I know that in the next few weeks, I'm probably gonna have baskets and baskets of tomatoes and I can't wait, but the vines are gonna get out of control if I don't keep tying them up now. And because it's so windy, I can risk them breaking off if I don't get them under control. So anyways, the first thing I'm gonna work on though is planting a citrus tree. So let's go do that first. This is it. It is a Dancy Semi-Dwarf Tangerine. And I purchased it for $24. It's in a really small starter tree pot, but that's okay because it's gonna take off in no time. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this variety as we're planting. Okay, just kidding. I completely forgot to tell you a little bit more about the tree. So I'm gonna tell you right now before we get to planting. So this is called a Dancy Semi-Dwarf Tangerine. The tree also is sold in a standard version if you don't want a smaller, more compact tree. But if you have a small garden or you just don't want a massive citrus tree, you can always get a semi-dwarf version, or you can just prune it back heavily to keep its size under control, regardless of what kind of tree it is. The citrus tree itself is a compact evergreen with dark, glossy green foliage. The ideal growing zones for this tree are 9 through 11, but that doesn't mean that you can't grow it in cooler zones. You just have to work around it a little bit because they can't tolerate the cold very much. They're actually hardy down to about 32 degrees. But if you do live in a cooler zone, you can always bring it in during the winter time. And I've seen people be so creative with the way that they grow citrus in northern states. For example, I've seen them put these pots on wheels with a basin underneath so that you can water it and the water doesn't just run off, and then that way they can wheel it in and out of their garage during the winter time and then out into their landscape during the warmer months of the year. I've also seen people growing citrus trees in sunrooms. I've seen people create greenhouses specifically designed for citrus trees, or growing citrus trees inside of hoop houses. So if you're growing citrus in cooler climates, please let us know how you're doing it, because I feel like everybody can benefit from getting all of these creative ideas so that they can figure out how to do it themselves too, because it's not impossible. This tree performs best in full sun exposure and thrives in a warm subtropical climate, but can also be grown as a patio tree in a container. I think growing it in a container would work very well if maybe you're renting, so you don't want to plant a tree in the ground and you want to take your tree with you, or if you don't have the space to plant it in the ground. And I'm actually growing all of my citrus trees in containers, not because of the weather here. I live in the low desert of Arizona, so I could easily plant all of these in the ground. but I can't plant them in the ground because my yard is covered in pavers and then the other half is covered in turf. So my solution to that was growing them in containers above ground and then setting them up on drip irrigation and all of that. But this way I get the production of the fruit without having to put it into the ground. And then one day when I move, I can go ahead and just bring all of my trees with me. The Dancy Tangerine blooms in late winter or early spring and is a very striking sight to see when it's covered in white fragrant flowers. But the best thing about this tree is the fruit that it produces, which is small to medium sized and has a thin, smooth, bright reddish orange rind, and is often described as one of the best tasting mandarins because it's very sweet and slightly tangy. This tree is a perfect addition to any home garden because you're not going to be able to find the fruit very easily in stores, and that's because their skin is so thin, which makes it very easy to peel, but it also means that it can get damaged easily. So each one must be hand harvested by clipping it from the trees so that there's no tears in the rind. And another reason for why you're not going to find the fruit very easily is because the tree usually displays alternate bearing, where one year it may produce a lot of small fruit and then the next year it might produce a lot less fruit, but the fruit will be bigger in size. So that's why it's not usually found in stores, because it can't be shipped long distances, and the tree itself is not necessarily a reliable producer for market because of the fact that it's known to alternate bear. Lastly, to keep the tree happy and healthy, plant it in well-draining soil and water regularly. I want to reiterate that the tree is ideal for growing in zones 9 through 11, but if you do live in a cooler zone, don't rule this tree out completely, because you can always grow it in a container and bring it in, or figure out some other creative ways to keep it alive so that you can also taste all of that delicious fruit. And please, 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 if you have successfully grown citrus or other subtropical or tropical plants in cooler zones, let us know how you did it. So anyways, that's a little bit about the Dancy Semi-Dwarf Tangerine. Now let's move on to the planting. I already have the container set up and everything. When it comes to soil for citrus, I try and make sure that it's really well draining. So I mixed in some sand, I added in some compost and manure, and that's about it. Usually I like to add mycorrhizae into the soil along with azomite. I'll use that to top dress, but I'm just gonna put it straight into the container because the soil in the container has been waiting for a while for something to start growing in there. So it's gonna be full of a lot of nutrients and life. So this tree will go right here. Dun 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 dun. But before I start planting it, I'm actually going to take it out of its container so that you can get a good look at the roots. Whenever I'm going to plant a new tree, the first thing I do is I remove any stake or tags. Even though the tree may need some staking, I don't like to keep the ones that it comes with because it's right up against the trunk. So if I plant it and I leave this stake, this tree is going to grow really straight. It's going to grow nice and tall, but it's not going to have any strength to the trunk because it's going to be used to being held in place by the bamboo stake that it comes with, or the wooden stake that it comes with at times. So the first thing I do is I take off any ties holding it to the stake. When I plant this tree, I want to make sure that the trunk moves with the wind. And the reason for that is because it's going to get a lot stronger, a lot faster if it's able to sway back and forth, because then it's going to start to stabilize itself. Versus keeping it with a stake, it's never going to move, so it's never going to get any stronger than it is now. I've had avocado trees that just flop over, citrus trees, guava trees that can't stand up on their own, even though they're like 3-4 feet tall. But as soon as I stop giving them that additional support, within a few months, they start thickening up because now they can move, you know? As it gets windy, they can sway back and forth. And if I feel like they still need support, I'll add stakes on the side, but I will never attach the trunk straight to a stake. It's just not gonna do the tree any good. Once the stakes are removed, I'll keep the tag. I'll leave it on the tree. That way I can remember it. And after a while, I start to memorize all the trees, but in the meantime, I'll leave the tag and I'm going to start taking it out of its container. There's a hole here at the bottom, so sometimes I'll squeeze the sides just a little bit just to loosen it, and then I give it a good push from the bottom. And then I can take that part off. And inside of here, I can see there's another stake. So I'm going to get rid of that too. And now I'm going to try and find the root flare. Oh, look, there's another stake. You see how much stuff they used to hold it up, get it to grow straight? but now we don't need that anymore. I'm gonna try and find the root flare. So this tree was buried all the way up to here. And you can see it's got some really nice roots going on. Overall, it looks like a beautiful tree, but I can already tell that it was buried way too deep at the store. No matter what the tree is, unless it started from a cutting, I like to plant it at the root flare. In this tree, there are 3 things that I'm looking at. Number 1 is the graft, and that's right here. And that's where we have a portion that is meant for the roots and a portion that is meant for the fruit. I want to make sure that's nice and healthy and that there's no other branches coming off of it, just so that I can always know what the graft is. I never want to let any branches start growing down here, because that fruit is probably not going to taste very good. It's probably going to be very vigorous, but I want to make sure that I only allow this portion of the tree to branch out and fruit. Now I'm going to start looking for the root flare, and that's where the trunk starts widening at the bottom. Even though there's roots up here, these roots started growing because it was planted so deeply, but that's not where the root flare starts. I'm actually going to remove some soil and go down a little bit lower, because if I plant it right here, it's going to start to suffocate the trees like the first 2 that I planted. I'm going to keep coming down here until I start to see that trunk flaring out a little bit. And usually you'll start to see it kind of break off into maybe 3 or 4 bigger, thicker roots. And I can start to see that happening down here. Let me rotate it. Yep, down here I can see the trunk getting a little bit wider, and it starts breaking off into a few more roots. It starts like branching out. Yep, so I would say I would bury it up to here in the soil. So it was planted this much too deep. If I plant it too deep, the tree will try and survive no matter what. So it'll push out more roots up here, and trees have different types of roots. So up here, you're going to have some feeder roots, and those feeder roots are going to bring up the nutrients, and they're kind of at the surface of the soil, but the tree will also just start to make its own roots, like as a way to try and just stay alive because it's buried way too deep. But if I want this tree to be the healthiest, happiest tree ever, I'm going to plant it right here, not all the way up here. It's got a bunch of other feeder roots right here where it needs feeder roots, but it put these out to try and just hang in there for as long as possible. Anyways, so plant it right here, not up there. Right here. I don't know why they bury them so deep. I don't know if it's for aesthetics, to keep the tree more upright, to make the tree look a lot more secure in the container. I'm not sure. And some of these roots might dry up, and that's fine. I don't mind. I'm not going to cut them off right now. I'm just going to let them be, just because I don't want to add any more shock to the tree. But I'm not going to plant it up there. I'm going to plant it right here. This is what the root system looks like. You can see all these gorgeous roots right here. And then right here, can you see how there's some thicker roots starting to break off? And most likely it's going to be about 3 or 4 roots. So the trunk starts to thicken right here. You can still see a lot of feeder roots that will take up nutrients and water and whatever the tree needs. These roots up here happened because it was buried way too deep, so the tree's still trying to survive. This is going to be a huge relief for the tree not being buried this deep. Now that I have my tree ready to go, I'm going to place it gently in my bucket so that I can carry it over to the other side of the garden. And I'm also going to bring all this soil along with it. I didn't realize it was going to be such a windy day today. It feels amazing. So this little tree is going to go right here into a 25-gallon container. Because this is a dwarf variety, I feel like I could plant it even if in a 15-gallon container. But because I already have this 25-gallon set up here, I'm just going to go ahead and put it into a really large pot. That way I don't have to worry about it running out of space or anything. And this tree is going to live in this container for years, up until I buy a piece of property someday, hopefully, fingers crossed. I've had other citrus trees that are 3 years old and they're doing amazing in the container. I haven't up-potted them, I haven't root pruned them, nothing like that. But I do make sure that I fertilize them, that I prune them, and that I water them regularly. and they're happy as long as the soil in the container is living. And I feel like personally, a lot of the time I notice that trees start to outgrow containers a lot faster if they're starting to search for water. They start pushing out more roots, trying to find water, trying to find nutrients, trying to find more soil because they're not getting what they need in the container. With these containers, they should have everything they need. And I recently amended these containers with some more sand and compost just to add a little bit more nutrition in them, but they already have a lot of organic matter. They're full to the brim with soil. They have worms in there. So it's not just a container of potting soil, it's a container of living soil. Okay, let me go get my thingy, trowel. Because these trees are so small, I don't need to dig too much. I'm just gonna start digging right in the center right here. I wanna make sure that my tree is as centered as possible because I'm not gonna be moving it for a really long time. And I wanna make sure that I don't bury it too deep because the tree was already buried a little too deep for my liking. So I wanna make sure that it's not suffocating or drowning in the soil. Next, I'm gonna take my tree and I'm gonna plop it in there, just like this. Just gently plop it in there. Usually I do like to add mycorrhizae as my worm castings, but I'm just gonna show you how to do it without any of that stuff just in case you don't have it. As long as you have good soil, you should also be good to go. It does always help, but it's not 1000% necessary. Next, I'm gonna start pressing the soil in around it. It's honestly so simple. My gremlins were planting their own fruit trees by themselves. I was giving them some direction, of course, but I was just letting them do it on their own because the process is so easy once the soil is good to go. Okay, so right here is where I start to see the roots flaring out. So up to here is where I'm gonna plant it. At the root flare. I know that it also seems like this is a huge container for such a tiny tree, and usually I would find a lot of recommendations to plant it into the next size up container, which would be like a 5-gallon, and then slowly up pot it over time. But I don't like to do that in serendipity because it takes too much time. I have to buy additional containers, and for the very first year of this tree's life, I don't want it to put on any fruit. I just want it to focus on setting out roots and on getting a lot bigger. It'll be able to do that in this container without being disturbed. I don't like to disturb these trees. I try and avoid it as much as possible. So I put them into a 25-gallon container or a 15-gallon container to start off. I never do anything smaller than that. That also works in my favor here in the low desert because during the summer it gets dangerously hot, and having trees in containers means that all of the heat is going to be radiating, and if the container's too small, the tree's going to feel all of that heat all around the sides. But having a bigger container helps me to insulate the roots of the tree a little bit more before they reach the sides. It just has more room, you know, the way it would in the ground where it has a little bit more insulation and it stays a little bit cooler. This helps out a lot too. So there you have it, the trees inside of the container. Now I'm going to reattach my drip irrigation. This one is drip line with 6-inch emitters. Bought it from Drip Depot, and that's usually my go-to place for all drip irrigation stuff. This variety, I think I already told you guys, is the Dancy Semi-Dwarf Tangerine. I don't have any tangerines in the garden, so I'm excited for this guy. So I'm just gonna go get a few landscape staples to keep this in place, and then I'll add a little bit of mulch, if I have any right now. These are the landscape staples that I like to use. I buy them on Amazon. You can also find some at Lowe's and Home Depot, but I don't ever buy them there anymore. I used to, but those would get so rusty and they weren't as thick. I like the ones from Amazon because these don't rust. They look brand new after like a year, 2 years of use, and they hold up great. I really like these. I'm actually gonna pick up a few more because I've gone through hundreds of these since I use them for my drip irrigation. So all I'm gonna do is coil the irrigation around the container. I find that this gives me the best, most even watering. I've tried different methods and I just like this one the most. So once I have that down, I'm gonna top the rest of it with mulch, if I can find any. Oh, I have a little bit right here. The reason I like to add mulch is because it's gonna do a few things. Number one, it's going to cover up the drip irrigation so that hopefully nothing messes with it, but also it's gonna help to protect the soil. Whenever it gets really hot, the water tends to evaporate out of the garden very easily. And so this is just going to keep moisture in the soil, and it's also going to protect the soil and everything living in the soil. And that's it. Now you can't really see the irrigation other than that line popping out of there, but it kind of fades into the background, especially when the tree starts to fill out. And as you can see, it can move back and forth, but because we've been having a little bit of wind, I'm going to add a tiny bit of support to this tree. And I'm going to show you how I stake it now versus how the nursery staked it. I need to buy some more garden tie, so I'm just going to reuse this one that I had from some tomatillos from last year. My favorite one has been one that I found on Amazon. I think I might have it linked. I'm not 100% sure though, so I need to go through my old purchases and look for it. But that one was just so much thicker than the one that I find at the garden center. For some reason, the one at the garden center went from being like $3, $4, and now it's like closer to $6, and it's thinner and weaker than it used to be, so I need to purchase some more on Amazon. To stake up the tree, I'm still going to use some bamboo. It doesn't have to be this tall. This is just the one that I happen to have. And I will use 2 to 4 bamboo stakes. So as you can see, the tree is right in the center. And instead of putting the bamboo like this right up against the tree and tying it to the tree, I'm going to put the bamboo off to the sides. And I always try and stick them in at an angle like this. It's not going to be like the most aesthetically pleasing forever, but it's going to help a lot for the next few months until the tree can stand up on its own. Once the tree starts pushing out some new growth and it starts thickening up a little bit, I'll remove the stakes. This is just in the meantime to get it going. So I need it to be about this long. So I double it, and then I'm going to break off this piece. And then I want to wrap it around the center of the tree, like halfway up the trunk. Definitely above the graft though, because the top tends to be a lot heavier. So once I have my tie tape around it, I'm going to give it a few twists, just so that it doesn't slide up and down on the tree. And then I'm going to bring it to one of my bamboo stakes. I'm going to wrap it around a few times. And then I also hold the tree right up in the center just to make sure I'm not pulling it too much. And then I can tie it in place. Just like this. Doesn't have to be anything crazy as long as it's standing up straight. Now I'm going to take my second piece of garden tape, and I'm going to make sure that I can reach the other stake, like right here. And I should still, sorry. And I should still have a little bit extra. And I'm going to do the same thing where I give it a few twists so it doesn't slide up and down. And then I'm going to tie it to the other stake. And I think that should be good enough. Now the tree is nice and straight. And even when the wind comes by, you can see it moving back and forth a little bit. So that'll help it get stronger over time. But it's allowed to move now. That's the most important thing whenever you stake a tree, is it has to be able to move on its own without falling over, of course. And I don't do this to every single new planting, just the ones that need a little bit more support. Now I just have to wait, and you'll get to see the progress of this little tree. It's not very tall right now, but just give it a year and it's going to look completely different. Here's a better view of the tree. You can see how much straighter it's standing. And then here's another tree that I planted, but I ran out of the tie, so I'm going to have to stake it up soon. Here's another one. This one was definitely flopping over, but the staking definitely helped. And then this one could totally use some staking too, because this is what I want to avoid, because otherwise it's going to be getting torn back and forth. So I'm going to see if I can find more tie tape. Poor little guy. I always feel so bad whenever I see my trees like that. I'm like, hang in there. I'm coming to help you soon. Oh, I found some more tie tape right here. When it comes to tying up the trees, I don't like using the cotton butcher twine, because I feel like that's just way too skinny. This is a 1-inch garden tie, and I feel like that's just thick enough. They also sell 1/2 inch garden tie, and those work well too, but 1 inch I think is my favorite, just because it's a little bit thicker, a little bit wider, and that way it doesn't cut into any of my younger plants or more tender plants. I'm going to use some shorter stakes, and I always put them in at an angle. I don't know if this is going to be enough, long enough at least. Let's get started. Oh, poor little guy. And because this one seems like it just needs an extra bit of support, I might also tie it to the T-post behind it. I pulled it that way a little bit too much. It's not entirely centered. So I'm going to loosen this part up just a little bit. I want to make sure that the tree can always stand up as straight as possible. There we go. That looks a lot better. Sometimes it takes a little bit of adjusting and going back and forth until the tree's standing up properly, but that's okay. It only takes a few minutes and it's definitely worth it in the long run. This tree looks so much better already, but I think it needs to be tied to that post back there just a little bit to get it to stand up extra straight while still allowing it to move around. But I ran out of garden ties, so I'm gonna have to wait until my new one comes in. But in the meantime, this should give it enough support to stand up to the next few windy days. And now that this is done, I can move on to the next thing on my garden list in the next video. But first, I'm gonna show you what the citrus trees look like today. We're at the very beginning of June and I want to show you what this citrus tree looks like. And actually I might just show you what all of them are looking like right now. So this is the one that we planted together. You can see all of that new growth that has been growing like crazy, especially these last few days. Look how beautiful that is. The tree is staked, but it's been doing really good even on the windiest days. It's been swaying back and forth, so I know it's getting stronger. There it is, the Dancy Semi-Dwarf Tangerine. And then this is part of my Eureka lemon that I unfortunately lost. So I've kept a portion of it. I need to get rid of it, but I kind of find it a little bit hard. Either way, I want to show you what the feeder roots look like today. As you can see, they've dried up on their own. I never wound up coming in here to chop them off. That's what the root flare looks like right now. So the tree looks amazing. It's definitely gone down over time. The soil has compacted just a little bit, but nothing too crazy. Here's an example of a tree where the soil got super compacted and now the tree's very low compared to when I first planted it. And that's why I usually plant my trees a little bit higher, because that just happens over time, especially with the soil that I pre-mix in these containers, because it's not compacted. It's very new, it's very fluffy. As it gets watered over time, it's gonna break down a little bit, especially some of the organic matter that I have in there. And that's why I like to plant my trees a little bit higher than usual, maybe sometimes a lot higher than usual, because I've seen how low these containers can get over the course of 1 year. This next one is, let's see here, the thornless Mexican lime. And these need to come off, but this little guy has been trying to fruit like crazy. So I come in here whenever I see little fruit beginning to form. I take them off. Usually the trees are really good about dropping that fruit themselves, but sometimes they're stubborn. As you can see, it's so teeny tiny, so it needs more time. It looks really happy. Something I want to keep in mind though with this tree that I'm noticing is the graft is right around this area right here. And this I know is a portion of the grafted tree, but then there's other little shoots that are a little too close to that graft. And if I don't take them off right now and they thicken over time, it's gonna be a little bit harder to differentiate where the graft is. And I don't want that to happen because I don't want to accidentally let any of the root stock grow, or the part that is meant only for the roots. Okay, so I'll come in with my pruners because it's kind of hard to take it off. But I do little cleanups like that. This next one is the clementine. This one has been growing a really good amount. Beautiful. And same thing, planted too deep, but then some of these roots started drying up and the tree itself is looking really good. Very nice and sturdy with a lot of new growth. There should be another one right here. Yep. This one is called the Mercot Semi-Dwarf Mandarin. And I can see some scorching on these leaves. Can you see that? Almost every single leaf has a little bit of sunburn. But the new growth is looking very, very good. This tree was really young when it was planted, but some of the older foliage, because it's not accustomed to this area of serendipity and maybe not even accustomed to the heat of the low desert, is still getting scorched. But the newer growth, which you would think would be a lot more tender, is holding up a lot better. And this is why I like planting younger trees, because I can get them a little bit more acclimated to the garden faster than some of the older trees who have spent a good portion of their lives living somewhere where it's maybe more ideal, where the growing conditions are more mild than it is here in the arid desert. But the tree itself is still doing really good, pushing out a ton of growth, and I think it's definitely helping out having more mature citrus trees around it, and also shade cloth to protect it from the Arizona heat. And right now it's the middle of the day. It's really, really hot outside, and this area of the garden is getting just enough sunlight without getting an overwhelming amount of sunlight. Last year, by this point, this whole entire area of serendipity, which is Citrus Lane, would have been fried to a crisp. But not this year, because we're working on microclimates. Okay, and then the very last, hold on, my okra. I haven't been harvesting it. I do apologize, you guys, but if I don't get to it right now, I'm gonna forget. The last tree that I'm about to show you is a navel orange, and that one is planted right here, and it's also looking really good. This is one of the trees that needed a little bit more support. Oh, and this peach is so in its way. Poor little guy. This tree needed a little bit more support right after planting because it just kept flopping over. So once I see that the tree has a little bit more stability, I'm gonna remove one of the stakes, because I think 3 is way more than what it needs. But the tree itself is looking gorgeous. Look at all of that new growth. And this one is actually living in Aurora Boulevard, where a lot of the deciduous trees live, and it's not really getting any sort of sun damage. It's doing really good, actually. How gorgeous. So those are all of the new tree plantings. Well, realistically, I wanted to show you the rest of the citrus because I might as well do it now that I'm out here. This next one is an Owari Satsuma, and this tree is looking stunning right now. But last year, it did not look anything like this. In fact, it looked very, very sparse and bare because the trees next to it, which is a Parfianca pomegranate and a Coolidge pineapple guava, had become so overgrown that they were weighing the tree down, and it wasn't getting enough sunlight and probably not even enough airflow. So it struggled, and once I chopped them back, the tree immediately started pushing out new growth, and now it's trying to fruit. And it's a sneaky little tree because I removed one piece of fruit the other day because it needs to grow bigger. It's way too young still. And then I noticed recently that it had like 3 more. No, actually it has more than 3. And also I'm gonna loosen this up right here. This is the tag because I don't want it to strangle the tree. Let's go around because I can see more fruit. Oh my gosh, I know that when I finally do let this tree fruit, it's going to be so productive because it would have held onto those. Oh my gosh, and there's another one. Oh my gosh, there's one more. Wow. You are crazy, little guy. This one my husband bought at Costco. To be honest with you, I feel like I haven't had the best luck with Costco citrus trees, but it might just be the ones that we're choosing. So the ones that I've gotten from there, I wasn't able to choose myself. My husband actually chose them for me. And with this one, I know I'm gonna have to deal with this at some point because that root does not look very good at all. And when he purchased it, he couldn't tell because similar to almost every other tree that I've planted in Serendipity, they're buried way too deep, and he didn't know to dig in to check the root system. So I'm eventually gonna have to cut one of these off to stop the tree from girdling itself. But you can already see how kind of gnarly it looks right off the bat. But it's a beauty. And while I'm here, let me just walk you through Citrus Lane so you can see what the citrus trees are looking like. The first container is empty right now because this used to be the home of my pink variegated Eureka lemon tree. I probably said that completely messed up. But that tree we also got from Costco, and ever since I planted it, it had been trying to fruit and it never really grew, but I didn't notice it because I was so busy planting other trees. I'm still a little bit confused by why it declined so much in health, because the soil is good. I even dug out the container a few weeks ago to look through the soil to see if there was anything in there that was a culprit for the tree not making it, but there was nothing wrong with the soil. It was really rich and loamy. It's set up on drip irrigation. It was being fed, but ever since I planted it, it just didn't thrive, and not too long ago I lost it. So eventually I do want to replace it because it was a really, really beautiful tree, but it did not make it, unfortunately. Next to that is a tree that made it behind this pigeon pea tree, and that is a red ruby grapefruit. And you can see one of the fruit on here, probably one of the only fruit, because last year it went above and beyond and it produced so many huge juicy grapefruits, and this year I didn't see it flower quite as much, but it has put on quite a bit of growth. It is super lush. And look at that trunk, isn't it gorgeous? And look at that root flare. The tree next to it, I think this one was planted from a tree starter pot as well, and this is an improved Meyer lemon tree. That's what the root flare looks like on this guy, and that's what the trunk itself looks like, and it is completely loaded with lemons. Ever since I planted this tree, it is a very, very heavy and reliable producer year after year. This tree has never once let me down. Ever since I planted it, it just took off. It's not very big in height. I feel like this is the first time that I see it starting to put on a little bit more, but it is very, very bountiful. I love this little tree. It is so beautiful. I'm definitely gonna prune some of those branches back though, because I want to keep the shape very nice and tidy, and I don't want it to look very full down here and all of a sudden have two little sticks popping up. But I'm not gonna do any pruning right now currently, just because it's pushing out new growth, which is good, but it's also super hot right now. We're about to start hitting some pretty bad heat waves, and when I looked at the weather, we're gonna be in the like 110s very, very soon, and I just don't want to add any additional stress to the tree. This next one is a Cara orange, and this one is beautiful. The shape of it is just absolutely stunning. This one, when I bought it, I got in a 5-gallon container because at that time I couldn't find it in little tree starter pots, but nowadays I feel like I see so many really cool varieties in the really small pots, so those are the ones that I would typically go for. And this one produced pretty good last year. I wouldn't say it was a huge harvest, but it was its first harvest, and I feel like the fruit never got to that super perfect ripeness like I wish it could have, but the fruit itself was really, really big. And that's what the root flare looks like, and that's what the trunk looks like. Okay, this next one is massive. It just keeps going on for days and days, and I need to fix my shade cloth because it's getting so hot that some of the zip ties that I used, even though they were the super, super heavy duty ones, are coming apart because the sun is just eating them up here in the low desert. This Moro Blood Orange, I don't think has made any fruit ever, and I don't think it made any this year either. There was a point in time where I got my hopes up because I saw like 2 flowers or so, but I don't think it kept any of its fruit. The fact that it's starting to flower gives me a lot of hope though, because it's already put on quite a bit of height. I know that it's got some good roots, and the tree overall looks really, really nice, but I need fruit. I can't wait to try this one. I know it's gonna be really beautiful, and I'm gonna appreciate the fruit a lot more once we finally get to try it, because the tree's definitely made us wait. And this citrus tree is called a Valencia orange, and this one I planted because it's supposed to be a lot better for orange juice. So these oranges are really good for juicing. Other oranges can turn more bitter over time after you juice them, but this one doesn't do that. It just stays nice and sweet. And this year it flowered a ton. It didn't make the most amount of fruit though, but it definitely made more than last year. And I'm happy about that because we got to try them, and this one was really nice and sweet and juicy, but it just didn't have that many of them. So this year we're gonna get to try a lot more. At least one per gremlin, which is all I can really ask for. Oh, look at these roses. These are the Lady of Shalott roses, except these are a lot smaller than the blooms that it was putting out earlier. Okay, I know that I have a few more citrus tucked away here somewhere. Oh, this one right here is a sweet key lime. And this tree, well, this part is not burnt. It's just the piece that I pruned off. Whew. This is a sweet key lime tree, and it lived in my mother-in-law's backyard for over 10 years. And I don't know exactly how old it is, but minimum 10 years old. And it was very overgrown. There was branches coming out everywhere. And to be honest with you, I don't know where the graft is. So there's a possibility that this might have even been the rootstock for a different variety. I'm not 100% sure, but my mother-in-law says that it produces very sweet key limes. So my whole reason for saving this tree, number one, is because I wanted it to keep producing key limes for my mother-in-law because she likes them, but she just didn't have space in her backyard to keep the tree anymore. So it would be so nice to be able to continue growing it for her and to be able to share the fruit with her. But I thought I could also use it as a little experiment where I can graft different portions onto the tree. That way I can practice my grafting, because I've only been successful with the first graft I ever did, and I tried a few times after that, but none of them ever really took. And the tree itself is very, very vigorous. I wasn't 100% sure that it would make it. If I'm being completely honest with you, I thought there was a very, very slim chance that it would make it at all. And I figured that if it did make it, it would be a few years before it even tried to fruit again. I thought it would be a few years before it started really recovering fully. But look at it. I've had to trim it back because it is so vigorous and it has so much fruit everywhere. Everywhere, which is so cool because I can give my mother-in-law some fruit. And I hope it's gonna make her so happy that her little tree is still doing really good here in Serendipity. This next citrus tree is a clementine, and look at those little baby clementines on it. After so many years of not producing anything, it feels surreal to see fruit on this little tree because it was so sick for so long. And let me show you what the root flare looks like now. Isn't that crazy? But you can see how deep it was planted. And it had a bunch of other roots growing up here at the time I chopped them all off. And I think that's one thing that I would change now compared to before, is I just chopped all those roots off, including a lot of the feeder roots, which meant that it took a lot longer for the tree to be able to recover and take up nutrients like it's supposed to. Now what I do is, if I buy a tree that's been planted way too deep, once I plant it, I just don't chop off those feeder roots. I wait for them to dry up slowly, and then that way the tree can start making more without me just chopping all of them off and leaving the tree to fight for itself. But look at how many clementines it's producing now. Isn't that crazy? Oh my gosh, once they start growing and ripening, it's just gonna look so beautiful. And then the last citrus tree is kind of hidden amongst the mangoes and the bananas, which is kind of crazy, huh? But it's this one right here. You can see some of the foliage right here. This is a bear's lime tree. This one is a semi-dwarf, and it's making lots and lots of fruit. I can see a lot of it up there too. This one's similar to the clementine, planted way too deep at the same time, and it took a really long time for it to recover. But I feel like this one started producing a lot sooner than the clementine. It's just that now it's really, really pumping out branches full of limes. And look how gorgeous the mango looks right next to it, reaching for the sun. But here's what I love. You can, oh, I saw the bananas, but for some reason I thought it was a bird right there. Look, you can even see some of the racks of bananas from this angle. Let's see right here. Isn't that so cool? And look, they're not even getting scorched because the other banana leaf is protecting them. Isn't that so beautiful? But this tree is just loaded with fruit. When it set flowers, it set a ridiculous amount of flowers per every inch. I thought there's no way it's gonna keep hundreds of fruit on one branch, and it didn't. I didn't have to go in and thin them out or anything. Rarely do I ever have to do that unless the tree is a very young, newly planted tree and it just for some reason is not dropping the fruit itself. Usually the trees will drop what they can't hold on to and they keep what they can. And this time around it kept a lot of limes, but nowhere near the amount of flowers that it made, which is a good thing because it made a crazy amount of flowers at first. But I'm telling you, there's just fruit everywhere. And that's basically it. That's all I wanted to show you. Okay, that's the the update.